hidden treasures of the 119th Psalm. How fun. We get a God hug today in verse 76 of the 119th Psalm. So, the verse 76 is very much connected to verse 75. We'll get into all that as we talked about verse 75 yesterday. 76 is the fourth verse in the Yud section, which are like the hands of God. And so God hug fits in there well. And the fourth verse being, if we use the Isaiah 11 template, would be might, which this is an interesting interpretation of might here. So to read the 76th verse in English, it says, "Let, I pray thee, thy merciful kindness be for my comfort, according to thy word unto thy servant." So you might recall that yesterday's verse was, "I know, O Lord, that thy judgments are right, and thou in faithfulness has afflicted me." So it's kind of like, when you get your spanking when you were a kid, and afterwards your father hugged you like he should to show you he still loved you in spite of the fact that you had done wrong or whatever that is. And so it's almost like King David saying, "I get it, I need to take my medicine. However, would you mind giving me a hug?" Because he's leaning on the fact that he knows that he's going to be afflicted, but here he's asking God for his hesed, his loving kindness, and so essentially he's asking God for a hug. And of course, he's saying, "You promised, according to thy word unto thy servant." And so I love this. And as I have talked about on one of my Christian Car Guys shows, there's four let it be's that happened in the Yud section, and this is the first. And so let it be that, let I pray thee. And there's a definite plea of please, please, please. Just like you can picture a child who's fixed to get a spanking or just had a spanking. Please, please, please show me you still love me. And so I have noted throughout my life that many times when I've been afflicted, if you look inside of that affliction, somewhere God always gives you a hug. It's just like the story I talked about, the Sunday school class coming to the hospital, or the Sunday school class building the wheelchair ramp, all those things. When I was afflicted, there was always something that God was showing me, oh yeah, I'm right here, and he's going to give me a hug. So years ago, I interviewed a missionary. Actually, a Billy Graham Association called me and said, "We want you to interview this North Vietnamese pastor." He wasn't a missionary. I apologize. It was a North Vietnamese pastor that has come into the country. And so he came and unfortunately didn't speak English. I had three interpreters, none of which, in my view, spoke English all that well. But nonetheless, I'll never, ever, of all my interviews ever on the radio, I'll never, ever forget this one. Because, I didn't know what he wanted to talk about, and it was very hard to communicate with. But one of my first questions that I asked the pastor was, the Billy Graham Associations, asked that I interview you, what did you want to get out to my audience? What do they need to know? And after several long sentences in Vietnamese, which were very hard to understand, and just pushing into what the interpreters were trying to say to me, and I really couldn't get it, finally one of them just said, "Prison." I said, "Prison? North Vietnamese?" I said, "When I think of a prison in North Vietnam, I immediately went to whatever it is, Rambo 3 or 4, where you might remember he was in that swamp with the big leeches on him." And so I just looked at him and I said, "When I think of a prison in North Vietnam, I'm thinking swamp." And like the Holy Spirit must have told me that, because immediately the pastor starts shaking his head and he says, "Oh yeah, he was in a swamp." I was saying, "In a swamp? How long was he in a swamp?" And it was for like 6 years he'd been in a swamp. And I said, "Well, how many people were in this swamp with you?" And he was like 700 or 800 people in the same swamp. And I was like, "Well, how do you sleep when you're in a swamp?" Standing up. "How do you eat? What do you eat?" "What's in the swamp?" "What do you drink?" what's in the swamp. And as I started to picture what kind of a turmoil this pastor had been through by being, essentially he had shared the gospel in North Vietnam, and they threw him in prison in this swamp with hundreds of other people. And so as I started to walk through that with him, I was just in amazement. I said, well, weren't people dying? He goes, oh, yeah, every night hundreds, not hundreds, but every night lots of people would die. And the sickness was all around you, and it was just obviously a horrible experience. I can't imagine not being able to sit down for years, right, of having to stand in the swamp. I mean, I can't even imagine what that's like. And so I said, well, often when God has afflicted me in some way, and I actually wasn't aware of this verse in the 119th Psalm at the time, but I just knew from my experience that anytime God had really allowed something like this in my life, he always had something that was just really special that he delivered to me. And so I asked the pastor that very question. I said, well, God always seems to give you something really cool when all these things come your way. What did he give you? And the pastor said, Psalm 91. And I was like, what? He said, yeah, that somehow or another, he had given him the entire 91st Psalm that he either had memorized beforehand or he knew it, and there's no doubt he knew it word for word in Vietnamese. So, I'm sitting there, I've got a computer right by it, and I pull up, which honestly at the time I had not that much of an understanding of what the 91st Psalm was. I'm sure many of you do. But when you read the 91st Psalm, when you think about you're in a swamp, standing up at night, the screaming and the howling, okay, of all these people dying all around you, you get this picture. So Psalm 91 says, he that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him will I trust. Surely he shall deliver me from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings thou shalt trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. For thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor the arrow that flieth by day, nor the pestilence that walk in the darkness, nor the destruction that wasteth at noonday. I mean, what an amazing, amazing thing. And so I was just like, well, Pastor, how did you get out of the swamp? And, after another long thing between all their, all the different interpreters, he said, well, good behavior. And I was like, good behavior. And finally they got word to me that essentially what was happening is this pastor was leading people to Christ in the swamp. And because he was leading them all to Christ, they had to get him out of the swamp because there were too many Christians in the swamp. Amazing. And as I was sitting there processing that, all of a sudden I just broke into tears because the Holy Spirit just made me aware of something. That, obviously a lot of those people that were in this prison were there because they had made a bad choice of some kind, murder, rape, stolen something. I don't know what caused them to be in the swamp. But undoubtedly, just showing you the very hesed, the loving kindness, let thy merciful kindness be unto thy servant according to thy word, right? God sent those people a pastor to lead them to salvation in the midst of this unbelievable horror of being in this swamp for whatever length of time. I've never, ever forgotten the story. I never, ever will. But I can assure you this verse is true. And that when you're afflicted, look for that God hug. It's coming. You don't know where it is. It may be in a swamp, but he will be there. I assure you. And his loving kindness is unbelievable. Thank you for listening today to the 119th Psalm.